Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. My name is Leah McMahon. I am the State PACE Ombudsman with Disability Law Colorado. I have been a steering committee member of the Colorado Coalition for Elder Rights and Abuse Prevention for almost 9 years now. We have a couple of other steering committee members that are in the room today. Troy, please stand up. Thank you. It is the steering committee members that brings the professional trainings to you on an annual basis. We usually have about 4 trainings a year and have recently, over the last year, expanded to some of the rural areas of Colorado. We have training evaluation forms, so please complete those. We want to hear your feedback and your input on other topics that you're interested in. As you hand those in on your way out at the table that was at the front, you will be able to receive your certificate of continued education credits. Today's training topic is Untangling the Complexities of Elder Financial Abuse and Exploitation. Our panelists include Dr. Sherry Gibson. She received her PhD in clinical psychology in 2013 with a curricular emphasis in geropsychology from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. She completed her internship at the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System and her postdoctorate fellowship at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs at Rocky Mountain PACE. Dr. Gibson is the former director of behavioral health services for Rocky Mountain PACE and brain care programs. She is faculty affiliate with the UCCS Gerontology Center as an instructor for integrated care in geriatric clinical settings. Dr. Gibson has published works in the area of elder financial abuse, for which she has received national recognition for her research and has presented lectures at national, local, and regional conferences. She serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect, is the chairperson for Colorado Coalition for Elder Rights and Abuse Prevention, and has volunteered for the Pikes Peak Elder Abuse Coalition since 2007. She is the 2015 Business Professional recipient of the Senior Resource Council's Joe Hingham Award for her commitment to improving the lives of older adults in the Pikes Peak region. Dr. Gibson is currently an independent consultant, trainer, expert witness, and practitioner providing services to corporations, institutions, and elder individuals worldwide. Catherine Seal is the senior member in the law firm of Kirtland and Seal, LLC in Colorado Springs. Ms. Seal is the public administrator for the 4th Judicial District of Colorado, serving El Paso and Teller counties. She is the first person ever awarded an LLM degree in elder law from the Stetson University College of Law, graduating with honors. Ms. Sill received her law degree from the University of Colorado Law School and holds a graduate certificate in gerontology from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. She is a member of the American Bar Association's Real Property, Trust, and Estate Law section and is the past chair of the Surrogate Decision-Making Committee. Ms. Seal is the immediate past president of the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys and is past chair of Guardianship Section and Litigation Section and is a fellow of the Academy. She is the past president of the Colorado chapter of NAELA and is one of only 6 attorneys in Colorado designated a certified elder law attorney by the National Elder Law Foundation. As a member of the Colorado Bar Association, Ms. Seal is a past chair of the Elder Law section. She is the author of Colorado Elder Law, published by Thompson West Publishing as part of their Colorado Practice series. Her practice is concentrated in the areas of elder law, guardianship, and conservatorship, probate, financial exploitation of the elderly, and related matters. Please welcome our presenters, Dr. Gibson and Catherine Seal.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Seal, and I can tell you that Dr. Gibson is every bit as distinguished as she sounded in her bio, and you really are in for a treat. The last time I came and spoke to you here, I was speaking about elder financial abuse strictly from the viewpoint of cleaning up the wreckage, looking normally at situations where somebody had usually advanced dementia or someone was now deceased and their estate had been looted. I've come to understand, like many other issues, it's a lot more complex than just what happened. And the relationships that are involved are very, very important. As we wanted to intervene earlier in the process, started to see somebody that looked like they might be taking advantage, trying to understand the dynamics of the relationship, that's when elder law attorneys that were involved in this area understood that we needed to work with psychologists and social workers to understand why this was happening, understand the system, and find interventions that were less drastic than depriving this individual of everyone that they cared about in their life in order to keep them safe and financially protected. And Dr. Gibson has done a lot to help me understand, and her research has done a lot to help further understanding of intervention. So we are going to take questions at the end unless somebody has a burning desire, they can't sit on their hands any longer, they must have an answer now. Otherwise, we'll wait until the end. I might ask you to wait until after the presentation if it's really heavily fact-specific and I'm not sure the whole audience is going to benefit from it. I understand that we have the room until 11, but our presentation is to go until when?
Can we do 10:30 and then take questions from 10:30 to 11?
Okay, all right. So we promise we'll at least stop talking at 10:30 so that we can answer your questions. So if you have a good memory, remember, or just write it down. All right, go ahead.
So I would be dissing on my PhD if I did not bring a little bit of research into the discussion. But I promise not to bore you too much with the empirical evidence. But really I want to pull your attention to what the most recent prevalence study has shown to us. And just coincidentally, there's not a lot of information on the prevalence rates and incidence rates of elder abuse. And the reason for that is that every state has a different definition for the different forms of elder abuse. And so just until recently have we started to get our heads around how to develop a national data set so that we have more accurate information. But what we have to our avail right now is a study conducted by Acherno and colleagues out of New York. And this was a telephone study where they randomly dialed older adults throughout the country. They got just under 6,000 respondents. And they asked the respondents whether or not they had been exposed to some form of abuse in the past year. And so what I want to bring your attention to is the, okay, well, I don't know if my little thing isn't, oh, maybe it is, and it's just very light. Well, I want to pull your attention to the top prevalence rate, and that is of financial abuse at 5.2% of at this study, followed by potential neglect, emotional abuse, physical, and then sexual abuse. And some of the most important findings that came out of this study was that 1 in 10 of those respondents reported some form of abuse occurring within that past year. Now, there's two real limitations to the study. One is that the study only captured those people who actually have a telephone and would be able to respond to those questions. We all know, those of us who work in this field, whether you're in case management, social work, law enforcement, that a lot of people who are victimized may not even have a telephone, wouldn't be able to answer a telephone call, wouldn't be able to sit on a telephone call and answer, even as discreetly as it may be, yes and no questions. That's one limitation. And the other limitation is that certainly this is just getting at the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of limitations with this kind of random dialing type of methodology, but it is what we have, and it has given us kind of a benchmark for understanding. The other two correlates that came out of this study that I think is important to us as practitioners is that associated with abuse was low social support and a previous traumatic event. So we know that social isolation is one of the key risk factors for abuse. And we also know that people who have been traumatized earlier in their lives are at higher risk for being re-traumatized or re-victimized in later life.
And I think one of the things that strikes me and probably strikes you about that data is this is someone's perception that they've been subject to abuse. Many of the people that we work with do not believe that the behavior that's going on is abuse. When we're looking at some of the interventions that we're trying to do, these people believe that this person is a caregiver, a support person, and don't like the idea that you might categorize that as abuse or mistreatment. So this is someone who already has a perception.
That's a great point. So just a rough definition, and of course definitions vary. The definition that I'm providing here about what exploitation is comes from the National Center on Elder Abuse website. Exploitation is defined as the use of deception, harassment, intimidation, or undue influence. And we're going to talk more about undue influence to permanently or temporarily deprive an at-risk elder of the use, benefit, or possession of their money, assets, or property. Also, without legal authority, that person employs the services of a third party for the profit or advantage of the person to the detriment of the at-risk older adult. What does that look like? An example may be that a son knows that his mother's home is going to be inherited to him at her death, and instead of using the money, her money, to pay for her medical costs or provide care throughout the rest of her life, that person uses the money then to make repairs or renovations to that home, knowing that home is going to be in that person's possession. So that is employing a third-party person to use that money that is taking away from the at-risk adult. Also, exploitation captures the forcefulness or a person compelling, coercing, or enticing an at-risk older adult to perform service for profit or advantage of the person against the will of the at-risk elder. It's misusing the property of that person in a manner that adversely affects the ability to receive their health care or health care benefits, or to pay bills for basic needs or obligations. So just some examples here, and I'm sure you all have your own examples, but that is denying access to one's accounts, to their resources, to their property, stealing or hiding those assets, intentional mismanagements of funds and use of deception, fraud, extortion, and forging. And I will mention that in this talk, as Catherine alluded to, we're really focusing on the relationship in these cases. Now, fraud is a whole different type of exploitation where it's more of a crime of convenience. So we're talking about what happens in that pre-existing relationship, whether that relationship has been only days old or decades old. And that's what we're talking about here today. But certainly fraud, forging a signature, all of those fall under exploitation, and improper use of legal documents such as MDPOAs, guardianship, conservatorship. The most common form of elder victimization is financial exploitation, as we saw in the prevalence rates. I will say anecdotally, when I've worked with certain law enforcement agencies and adult protective services, that financial exploitation is one of the largest occurring crimes in elder abuse. It's very difficult to detect elder financial abuse because it is hidden from view. It is unlike sexual or physical abuse where we have a bruise, we have a biological marker of some sort. Here it's embedded within those close interpersonal relationships and within documents, reams of documents, signatures that are the victim's signatures, may or may not be the victim's signatures, but certainly are assumed to be that signature, looks like it's voluntary and may not be voluntary.
And one of the classic ways to do this, where it's very difficult to detect, is commingling. And I'm sure those of you that have looked at the financial accounts in a case where you had concern when somebody is putting the income of the senior into an account with an occasional, at least token, deposit of their own in order to characterize those funds as joint funds. Or maybe legitimately it's a joint account. But then you have to look at the expenditures and try to determine whether the expenditures, at least of the funds that were the seniors, were spent for the benefit of the senior. And that is one of the reasons commingling is so frowned upon by people who are acting in a fiduciary role for someone. If you are managing someone's finances, you are not supposed to use any kind of joint account, and you are not supposed to pay your own bills out of the senior's account. Keep the account separate and pay only the senior's bills out of that account. Because as any of you who've ever done this kind of investigation work know, it is really difficult to try to figure out where all the money went and whether or not the senior got the benefit of their money.
Yeah, great point. And then lastly, we do know too that financial crimes often coexist with other forms of abuse. So the idea here is that once the perpetrator knows that there are assets to be had, they will take whatever means available to them to make sure that they get those assets. And I think what is important to note here is that, some of the first cases that really brought financial exploitation to the public light were those large cases such as Mickey Rooney and Brooke Astor, the famous New York philanthropist, who were bilked out of millions of dollars. But what we're talking about here in the work that you all do and we do is that this could be a person's Social Security check. This is an $800 check that a perpetrator will do anything that they can to get that money for their own benefit. And so we know that these other forms of abuse co-occur. So why is it a problem? Well, we know that it's the fastest forming, most common form of elder abuse, as Cherno and colleagues demonstrated. It also coexists with other forms of abuse. And there are some assumptions by both researchers, APS caseworkers, and investigators about why older adults either underreport or don't report. And this particular question was at the center of my own dissertation of understanding why do older adults, what gets in the way of people coming forth? And those assumptions are that one, there's no physical mark, so somebody else may not discover it right away, as if Mrs. Smith walks out her front door and she's got a bruise on her eye, somebody might take note of that and call somebody. With financial abuse, it's very different. It's, as I said again earlier, it occurs over time in these close interpersonal relationships. There's a lot of feelings of shame and embarrassment. Any one of us can be unduly influenced. And we're going to talk about that psychological component that's used in many of these cases. But any one of us can, whether or not we have intact or deficits in our cognition. And so there is a feeling of shame and embarrassment that somebody has been bilked out of their money.
And that's more common in situations where somebody's fallen for a contractor scam or an investment scam of some sort, where they don't want to disclose to their kids that happened. They don't want, obviously, think about it from a common sense point of view. You're fighting for autonomy. Half your neighbors are in nursing homes. You have every intention of staying in your home. If you let your kids know that you fell for an investment scam, they're going to give you a lot more help than you want. And the next thing you know, you could be out of your house. So there's the shame, there's the embarrassment, and there's the protection of autonomy that you may not be willing to disclose to the people who could help you what happened to you, even if it's a third party and not someone you have affinity for, who has basically swindled you out of your money.
Yeah, what's interesting about that too, Catherine, is that this fear of the loss of independence, the autonomy, losing one's autonomy, is that what we know from a lot of the cases is that by the time the victimization is discovered, that individual may have decompensated so much so physically that they may lose their independence. They may have also lost all of their savings. And so a large majority of these cases, as my understanding, is that a person does go into another living situation. So the fear is there, but there's also a reality to that. And so there's also that fear, too, of the reprisal from the perpetrator. So if I say anything, it's going to get worse. Or this is the only person who takes me to church, gets my medications, cooks a meal for me, maybe gets me out to my appointments if I can depend on them. This is that only person. If I say anything, I'm going to lose that one thing that I have.
And we're going to limit our war stories, but the most chilling story I have on that was the audio tape from the financial institution. And the senior who was wealthy, the caregiver who was a family member, had taken one of his brokerage checks to a car dealer and had bought a very expensive imported car. The signature was in question. So the financial institution was now calling to verify that the senior had in fact negotiated that check. While they were on hold, they were being recorded. And the caregiver was in the background saying, if you don't tell them that's your signature on the check, you're going to a nursing home.
Mm-hmm. Thank heavens for recordings. I think, too, what's always at the forefront for me as a psychologist is this ethical dilemma that comes up in these cases, and that is the conflict between autonomy and protection. Some of the ethical principles by which most of us in this room operate, and what I think come to the surface most commonly, are those of beneficence, so do no harm; autonomy, the aim that every individual has a right to their own lives, self-directed lives. And I think where cognitive impairment then enters the picture, there becomes a lot of conflict between those two. Because some people would say, well, I think all of us would say who have expertise in this area, especially around cognition, is that cognition and capacity is on a spectrum. It's a continuum. So it's not a light switch that you can turn on and off. It's not a faucet that you turn on and off. It's, unfortunately, the courts typically want to know if a person has or doesn't have it. But the capacity to, say, sign a check, to count coins, to make change, is very different from the capacity to change a will, a trust, make a charitable donation. All of those are on a continuum and require a different level of varying cognitive ability. And so when we talk about cognitive impairment and autonomy, it's really important that, one, we understand what exactly that person is needing to do to function, and what do we bring to that discussion? As we are investigating or intervening with families or victims, we all come to the table with our own biases or our own bent on where we stand on that continuum of autonomy and protection. So I know for myself, I tend to be on the side of autonomy. I want people to be independent. I just advocate for that at every moment. But I also know that if that's where I'm leaning towards, I might miss something. There might be a blind spot for me that I'm not asking the right question. And so it's important that as we work on teams, and if you're not in a true team, you need to have a virtual team. You need to know who your team is out in the community and be able to check in and consult with one another. Some of the things that we want to know when we're talking about cognitive impairment is, what are those person's values and preferences throughout their life? Is the decision that they're making right now in line with that? Who decides what's in that person's best interest? Is there a surrogate decision maker? And are they making the decisions that are in line with that person's preferences and values? And is that decision maker acting in the interest of that person or in the interest of them?
I have to get on my soapbox now.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, making decisions for another individual is a responsibility that people don't get the education they need in order to understand their role. Attorneys do a terrible job. Here, sign, who do you want to be your agent under power of attorney? And then mom appoints the kid with the gambling problem to be in charge of her finances because he's the oldest son, and in their family system, that's who always gets this job. And then everybody later goes, I'm really surprised he took all mom's money. Of course, he did have a gambling problem. Okay. So attorneys screw up here because they don't have enough of a discussion with clients about why are you choosing this person? Why are you giving them authority? Is this really the most appropriate person? It may not be one of your children. It may be somebody else who's really the best person to make decisions. The worst is when mom says, I'm going to put all 5 kids on my financial power of attorney. God, no. But how do we make decisions for an individual? First, we verify, as Sherry said, the individual cannot make the decision themselves. It's not a light switch. We need to try to understand whether or not we have the right to intervene and make a decision as the surrogate decision maker, or whether the individual should be allowed to make the decision themselves. It's not easy. Mm-hmm. It's even harder if you didn't know this individual until they became incapacitated or at least needed assistance. If they can't make the decision, what decision would they make? Were they capable of making the decision? So what information do we have? Maybe you know them, maybe you're the adult child, maybe you're a family friend, and you look at the decision that's in front of you, and you look at their life, their values, the decisions they've made throughout their life, and you make the decision that they would make were they capable of making the decision today. That's not necessarily a decision in their best interests. And why is that? Because we're not nannies. We have to respect the autonomy of the senior. We make decisions for children based on best interests because children have not had adult decision making. If your child wants ice cream for dinner, you say, no, sorry, I did ask you what you wanted for dinner, but you're not getting ice cream. Maybe for dessert. But when a senior wants something, even if it's not necessarily what's in their best interests, you really have to determine whether or not it's really going to harm them or just not be ideal for them before you override either their expressed preference or their historically known preference. It's a lot harder to do. Best interest is not the default. I always say that seniors are not wrinkled children.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I'm thinking too, I mean, one of the things that I think Catherine and I bring to this training that might be different from other trainings is that she and I have a lot of different cases or situations that we've been involved in, and probably the most salient one for me and that highlights this particular conflict was in being called by a facility once for a client, a resident there, and the administrator called and said, we've got a huge problem. We think there is resident-on-resident sexual abuse happening, and your client's involved, and we want you to call the police. And I said, well, let me get some information. Let me see what's going on. They said, well, one of our staff has discovered your client, who was a female woman, having sexual relations with a male resident. And we think that there might be some kind of abuse going on. So I called the resident to my office, and I said, I want to talk with her first. And what I found out through my own interview with this individual was that her sister-in-law was her MDPOA. And the sister-in-law was involved in her medical decision-making because this woman had had a stroke. And she was married before for roughly 40 years. And one morning she woke up and her husband had died of a massive heart attack in the middle of the night and was dead in their bed. About a year after that, this woman suffered a stroke. And she didn't have any other family members. They didn't have children. And so her sister-in-law brought her from another state to Colorado to live. and realized that she couldn't manage the needs of this individual, so transitioned her out of her home into this assisted living. Well, what happened was the sister-in-law, both of these women were lifelong smokers, and the sister-in-law quit smoking and decided that it was the best interest of this resident, this client, that she should quit smoking. After all, she's had a stroke. We know smoking's bad for you. We know it increases your risk for more strokes. And so she told the staff to take away her cigarettes. What was happening was this woman was exchanging sexual favors for cigarettes. It turns out when I was interviewing her, she said, well, she was doing sexual favors for one cigarette. So I thought, well, first of all, we need to talk about negotiation. But it was clear. And so when I asked her more questions about this relationship, is the relationship important to you? No. I loved my husband. We were married for so long. She talked about her addiction to cigarette smoking, that she loved smoking. I asked her, had you ever tried to quit smoking? Never. I never wanted to quit smoking. My sister-in-law took away my cigarettes, and so now this is how I get my cigarettes. So what I did was I called a meeting with the sister-in-law, the administrator from the assisted living, and myself, and I explained the situation to the sister-in-law. And I said, let me talk to you about risk. Let me talk to you also about preferences of your sister-in-law. Because I think what happens in a lot of families is that it's very well-intentioned. The spirit was of love and kindness for her health. But in fact, she was putting her at higher risk for potential rape and for potential sexually transmitted diseases. And so when I explained it to her in that way, she really understood it. And we were able to give the cigarettes back to the resident, and wouldn't you know, the behavior stopped immediately. We didn't have to pull either of those people out of the facility. We didn't have to call the police. And we just had to have some education around that. And so I think for me, that was a real defining moment, and I think that that can happen in families where there's just this lack of education about those documents and about what those preferences and interests are. So the ethical principle of autonomy is that everybody has the right to make their own decisions, even if those decisions appear eccentric or even foolish. I don't know about any of you, but I am making poor decisions all the time. I will probably continue making poor decisions, eccentric decisions, foolish decisions, even in my 80s. The implication, though, as I said before, is that if we don't look at some of the other underpinnings around decision making, we can turn a blind eye to asking the more difficult questions. And so we don't, for fear that we might tread upon that person's autonomy. But we have to ask the question. And that's the important, probably the most meaningful work that all of us do in these cases, is asking the tough question, because in my experience, in my limited experience, probably compared to a lot of you in here, is that when I've asked the question, the person will want to answer. Sometimes they don't, but if I don't ask the question, then I won't know. So again, people can make poor decisions. The question is that when is the person's decision-making compromised by some type of cognitive impairment, deficit, disease, disorder, or psychosis? Let's talk about the societal consequences of elder financial abuse, because I think this is really important to kind of hone in, how does this affect us as a society? MetLife did two very important studies where it's a very simple methodology, but what they did is they obtained media clippings for a 1-year period of time, and they calculated how much money had been reported as being exploited from older adults that was reported in the media. And what they found was that in 2008, that number, according to these media clippings, had been $2.6 billion. Several years later, in 2011, it was $2.9 billion. That's just the number that's being reported to the media. What we know is that about 1 in 10 financial victims, abuse victims, will turn to the Medicaid system as a result of losing those assets and monies.
And a lot of important things about that. One is, for those of you that know anything about Medicaid for long-term care, we've got a 5-year look-back period. And so this may be a situation where mom wants to say, those were gifts. Well, gosh, if they were gifts and the son and daughter can't give them back, you don't qualify for Medicaid. There's a disqualification period for the amount of care that the value of those gifts would have purchased. So it's a pretty horrific result for people who didn't know that rule was out there. Mm-hmm. But the other reason it's important is because it's not all that easy to get enough care in the home through Medicaid. Most people end up in assisted living or long-term care. Whereas if they would have had the financial resources to pay for some supplemental home care, even if they had qualified for other assistance, they might have been able to stay in their home even longer. So it's the cost to the senior in terms of possibly being institutionalized in a situation where they might not have been had they had the resources. It's also a societal cost. Because Medicaid is a huge component of the state budget, and a perpetrator has the money, and taxes pay for the care. So it's a cost that shifts from the senior and the resources that the senior had to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And then certainly in my role as a psychologist, I am often confronted with the personal consequence to the older victim. That is a loss of trust, certainly a very traumatic experience for many people. Loss of a sense of security, depression, feelings of shame, feelings of anger, self-doubt, remorse, worthlessness. Certainly the financial destitution that occurs secondary to exploitation, in the sense that when an older adult loses their money, they're not like their younger counterparts where if they lost their money to the stock market, they can go out and maybe make it back up. They can't make it back up. So there is a destitution that occurs, an inability to maybe obtain legal help or protection, or even to know what is available to that individual. Inability to provide or obtain their long-term care needs. So their luxury of choice has been stripped from them. They don't have a choice now about how to spend the money or how to provide for their own care, or maybe the legacy that they want to leave, that they wanted to leave for their families. And certainly the loss of their primary residence. My mother just paid off her home about 2 weeks ago. She was a single mom, and I got to tell you, it was the most amazing day for her when she wrote that last check for that home. Our homes mean a lot to us. And for older adults, it was a sense of security. It was the one thing that they would be able to leave behind for their children. And so the loss of your primary residence not only has a devastating financial and security impact, but the emotional loss around losing one's home is beyond anything that any of us can imagine unless we've gone through it.
And I'm going to make a little plug here. We know that for middle-class people, being able to pass on a residence is a huge thing. We know that millennials, in particular, are having a really hard time affording homes. They're not buying homes, they're renting. A caregiver child can retain mom's home, provided they meet the Medicaid rules. You have to be able to verify that you did provide the care, you lived in the home for at least 2 years, and Had you not provided the care, the doctor says that mom would have been institutionalized. People don't understand, and you see deed transfers that didn't need to happen. You see transactions that are flagged as fraud and are disqualifying. Didn't need to happen. All that needed to happen was for the kids to decide, no, we can't all keep the house. That's mom can't bequeath it to all 5 of us. But there's one, maybe it's the daughter who's divorced and on kind of a budget, can move in with mom and take care of mom. Families can retain the residence. It's not such a punitive system that you can't, but it requires a commitment. So seniors struggle with the fact that they want to leave a legacy to the next generation. They want to pass something on. But at the same time, the rules for financing long-term care tell us that those resources can't be diverted to another generation. They have to be used for the senior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So very quickly, here are some of the risk factors for perpetrators and victims of elder financial abuse, and this comes from the literature. We know that demographic variables vary. There are some similarities between domestic violence and elder abuse. One of those demographic variables is that 60% of perpetrators are male and relatives of the victim. That person is financially dependent on the victim. And what's interesting is we used to have, there's many frameworks, psychological frameworks of why abuse occurs in later life. And one of the frameworks was this model of dependency. But we used to think that dependency was one directional. So the older adult is dependent on the perpetrator for something or many things. What we know now is that dependency is bidirectional. The older adult is dependent on the perpetrator, and that perpetrator is dependent on the older adult for their finances, for their shelter, for their car. It could be any number of things. Also, we know that substance abuse, unemployment, poor health, and mental illness are risk factors, and that there's a key psychological component that we'll dive a little bit deeper into on undue influence, and that is that coercive psychological tactics that are used. And the perpetrator, is typically an individual in a position of trust. And what I found in my own research around this question is I used vignette methodology and I manipulated the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. And what I thought was that if the perpetrator was a close relative, that it would be that the older adult would be less likely to report the abuse. And so I manipulated the strength of that relationship, which was the a close relative, a distant relative, or a new friend. And I also manipulated the type of abuse. And what I found was it really wasn't the relationship itself, but I asked one important question that I kind of threw in at the end, and it was one of 2 things that I got any statistical significance, so I'm glad I asked it, and that is, what is your perception of the strength of this relationship? And the perception of the strength of that relationship was the determining factor for reporting abuse or not reporting abuse. And so it didn't matter whether or not that person was a new best friend or whether the person was a close relative. It was the perception of the position or the relationship. So in a position of trust is very subjective. It can be who we all think it is, which is, maybe it's a professional, maybe it is a relative, or Catherine and I both know of, where people will talk about this, I'm having a loss for words, fictive kin. So she's like a daughter to me. And so it is that position of trust.
And that's when you know that you're a little bit jaded. Because when my husband's first wife said, "My mother has a new friend," I said, oh no, tell me more about this. And what we discovered over time was that, and I'm friends with my husband's first wife. Her mother was someone that I knew, spent a lot of time with at family gatherings. My husband always laughs and says we're like old lady whisperers. They can tell we're the elder law attorneys. And so, you know, we were her people that she looked out for everything. And her daughter had made the decision she shouldn't drive because she'd had a couple of car accidents. And probably it was more drinking than anything else. But she was at an age where it's probably not a good idea for her to be driving anymore. The new best friend was telling her, your daughter's wrong. Your daughter's wrong. Because she said, you know, your license is expired. Why don't you just not renew it? And the new best friend was saying, I'm going to take you down and get your driver's license renewed. And she did discover that the friend was receiving small gifts from her mother. But I knew it from the moment she described this new relationship. You know, daughter lived out of state, and the friend was over all the time, and they did things together. And, you know, for most people, it would be like, gosh, mom's lonely. Isn't that nice that she's got a new friend? But for me, it was like, oh, God. But that is actually the term. When you say new best friend, anybody that deals in elder abuse goes, oh, yeah, the new best friend. Mm-hmm. She's the mother I never had. She's the daughter I never had. Yeah, okay.
So we also have some characteristic risk factors for victims of elder abuse, and that is widowed women over the age of 75. And I'm sure that for those of you in the room, you probably know why that is. First of all, women outlive men where we are at this moment, and that in that cohort of 75 or older, there were gender roles within those opposite sex marriages for sure, where men were typically the handled finances and women did not. And if women are living longer, then they are left doing something that maybe they had no skill, no knowledge of prior to their husband's death, their spouse's death. So that creates a risk factor. Also being geographically or socially isolated. The presence of some kind of cognitive disability or physical disability. A sensory deficit, so hearing or vision impairment. Cognitive decline secondary to either a dementing process or maybe depression, medication, acute illness. Those are some of the risk factors that we see for victims. I want to touch on the psychological component of undue influence, and we've had a full training just on undue influence in this setting, and you can find those trainings online in our archives. So it's a very big topic, but we're going to touch on it a little bit here because it really does play into when we talk about undue or financial abuse, we have to talk about undue influence. Undue influence, just by definition, is the misuse of one's role and power to exploit the trust of another. Plays a huge role in elder financial abuse. And undue influence, although any one of us can be unduly influenced, the risk factors are isolation, cognitive deficits, or major life transitions such as widowhood, moving from one city to another city, or moving from independent housing into an institutional housing or assisted living. Any of those major life transitions. And what makes that difficult is really for the person to be able to resist, to be able to critically think through something, and to be able to say no.
In the legal realm, we look at undue influence in situations where we believe that the individual making the decision is not making the decision they would make. They're making the decision that someone else has insisted they make or influenced them to make. So someone is substituting their will for the other individuals in that decision. Mm-hmm. Influence happens in our lives. Again, if you're a parent, do you influence a child's behavior? All the time. hopefully you're trying to, teach your kid to shut the door, clean up their room, brush their teeth. You're trying to influence and shape their behavior because that's your responsibility. So you're trying to create the influence that molds the behavior that you're looking for. In the undue influence world, someone has a decision that they need to make, but they're prevented from making the decision through coercion, through whatever process necessary for the other individual to make sure that that person makes the decision they want. It's difficult. I mean, anybody who's married knows what happens when your spouse has a decision to make and you know the decision you want them to make, and what kind of pressure you might put on them. But this is someone who's not able to resist. For whatever reason, they are unable to resist and insist that they make their own decision. And so they basically cave in some way and make the decision the other person wants them to make.
So it's important to note with undue influence that it's not an event, but it's a process. So in other financial crimes where you have somebody who walks into a convenience store, points the gun at the cashier, says, "Give me your money," it's caught on tape, that's an event of a financial crime. But where undue influence is different is that it's a process that can occur over decades. I was recently involved in a case that it truly was decades of grooming and insidious taking of assets and monies over time that got this gentleman to a point of, essentially homelessness. And so we know that it's a process. Since the 1990s, undue influence started to become a topic of interest in these cases of financial abuse. And the reason why is because it seemed like to investigators, to social workers, that the person was acting freely. I mean, it looks like it on paper. Yes, that's my signature. Yes, that's her signature. And that they gave consent to whatever decision was being made or whatever transaction was occurring. But they also remained in an abusive relationship. And they either defended the individual, denied that things happened, or recanted after they reported. And that is a very similar victim behavior that we see in battered women's syndrome. And we'll talk about the common tactics that have been translated from battered women's syndrome to help explain elder abuse and elder financial abuse. And certainly the victim then denies the presence of any wrongdoing, even in the face of significant loss. Victims with cognitive impairment are particularly vulnerable to undue influence, as we stated before, and therefore may not be acting freely in these transactions. Perpetrators gain compliance through coercive tactics, and we'll talk about what those tactics are. But cognitive impairment and coercion do not explain those situations in which those victims appear to be acting freely. And that's where it gets really tricky for investigators, for prosecutors. We know that the study of persuasion has been around for a very long time. It's how
You can do it.
Thank you. Forget it. It was a long night. How regimes control populations. We'll just leave out that word altogether for live streaming. How captures induce their prisoners of war. Some early, you might remember the prison study that came out of Stanford from Philip Zimbardo way back in the 70s. This is all the study of persuasion, how cults recruit and maintain members. Jim Jones drinking the Kool-Aid. I remember that as a kid watching that newsreel. Why victims of domestic violence stay in those abusive relationships or don't take action against their batterers. How caregivers maintain control over those that they care for. Hostages bonding with their captors, the Stockholm Syndrome, for those of you who know that term. how professionals even exploit their relationships and the trust and confidence toward their clients, and how white-collar criminals and con artists use manipulations and deceptions for financial gain. Bernie Madoff, you know, we've all seen certain cases. So persuasion has been around for a very long time, but we're just now getting to understand what is going on in that trusted relationship. Are you going to say something? I'm sorry.
I was going to talk about the wheel. This is really great. We have permission to use this from the American Bar Association. And this Lori Stiegel created this, along with, I don't remember the first names of the others. I don't think I know either of them.
Bonnie Brandel, who's first author, she gave a lecture here for us.
Okay.
For those of you who attended.
It always seems like the perpetrators have the same playbook. And you wonder, wait a minute, isolation, change the phone number. Every time somebody comes by, they say, you know, he's asleep, whatever it is. When you look at the wheel, that sort of explains it. That's exactly what's going on. Isolation. Keeping the individual unaware of what's going on. Maybe they don't get to see the mail anymore, so they don't see the brokerage statements. Prey on vulnerabilities. Perform intermittent acts of kindness. I'm the only one that cares for you. No one else comes by to see you. No one else is here. So it's the combination of behaviors. It's, you know, it's a complex situation, and you can sort of understand, looking at it, why a relationship would develop that would be complex and would be important to the individual. So that's why intervention is so difficult.
Yeah. So more recently, Quinn and colleagues in California, Mary Joy Quinn, came up with this framework for understanding undue influence. And this is really relevant to our discussion because oftentimes we get a feeling maybe that something's going on. It feels fishy. We even get like a visceral response when we're maybe talking to a victim. And so what they decided to do was, well, let's take that visceral response and actually go into case law in California and let's weed through and figure out what are the main factors or themes that come up in these cases that have been substantiated to understand what might be a framework for identifying undue influence. And so the 4 factors that they've come up with, or the 4 components for undue influence, include factors that affect the susceptibility or the vulnerability to abuse. So those factors may look like some of those risk factors we already talked about. Certainly cognitive impairment, mental illness, recent life transition, widowhood. Those are some of the susceptibilities that you want to be looking at. The second component is the role and relationship between the victim and the abuser. So is this the new best friend? Is this person just been given authority, decision-making authority? Is this a priest? How long has the relationship been there? Did the relationship just start after Mrs. Smith's husband died and now the neighbor is now taking over things? You want to look at the role and relationship. How long has the relationship been established? And what's the role? And is there a power differential in that relationship? Who's gaining what from that relationship? The third thing you want to look at is any psychological manipulations or techniques that's being used. So not maybe missing doctor's appointments, not allowing the person to talk to family members, maybe using threats, either overt threats or covert threats. Some of those tactics that we showed on the wheel, those are some of those psychological manipulations that you're going to want to know if that exists in this relationship. And then the most important, I think, component is the outcome. what was the outcome based on all three of these aforementioned components? Did the person lose how much assets were lost? Did they lose assets? Are they now in assisted living where they were in independent living just 6 months before? Is the person physically compromised where 6 months ago they were fully independent? Did they lose their bank account? Is this person now on all their bank accounts? Those are the outcomes that you want to be looking at. And so lining these up and looking at what was the direct result of all three of those components is how Quinn and colleagues have kind of put this a framework for us together.
And it would be easy if we only looked at situations where somebody had extreme cognitive deficits. Because you could pretty much assume in those situations any transactions that occurred at that time were not of the person's own volition. There's a problem with those. The complexity is when you have someone who has, at the most, mild cognitive impairment, at the most. But when you start adding on bereavement, this individual just lost a spouse of 40 years. And the interesting one is, guess who's more likely to be scammed immediately in widowhood? The statistics show it's the man, not the woman, that a recently widowed man is more likely to end up in a sweetheart scam than the woman would be. They fall prey to a variety of assistance from people who offer them companionship, some sort of household assistance. I'm just dealing with one of those yesterday where the individual moved into the home, and it wasn't until about 3 years after it actually occurred that the daughter discovered that dad had married the woman he described as his housekeeper. They got married and no one knew. You know, dad at that time was not significantly impaired, but he did in fact decline later. But the factors, he was vulnerable. He had the most mild impairment to the point where the evaluation that was done at that time said, there might be some issues, there might not be. And then another evaluation done 5 years later said, all those things I saw, the evaluator said in the first, those were clearly the beginning of a cognitive decline. I now know that and can confirm that based on the data several years later. But at the time, that wasn't really clear. But we had isolation, we had bereavement, we had dependence. Someone who was not comfortable taking care of themselves, had never done that, and here was someone offering to take care of them.
And what was the outcome in that particular case? Like, what was the
eventual outcome? He just passed away, and one of the things that was done was a will leaving everything to her. And so unless there's a will contest, she will receive his estate.
Yeah.
And not his children.
Yeah, thank you. So these slides are going to be made available to you on our website, and I'm not going to go through each of these because I just kind of explained it, but we wanted to include it on these slides so that you have it available to you. It goes more in detail on each of those factors that I talked about.
All right, I'm going to go back to the one before that.
This one? Okay.
Yeah. You cannot overestimate the dependence and whether it's actual or perceived. I had a client who was quite wealthy, but he lived in an apartment on the East Coast. He had a fall, and he was not discovered for a few days. And when he was discovered, he ended up hospitalized. Then he ended up in a skilled nursing facility where he did not want to be. And he called a nephew from out of state who came and got him and took him back to his home and began a significant campaign of financial exploitation. The client could not and would not believe my assurances that he did not need this gentleman and his family to care for him, that we could arrange for quality care at whatever setting he wanted. He could buy one of the biggest mansions in Colorado and could have lived in that with a staff to take care of him. But his perception was so strong, I laid there in that skilled nursing facility thinking I would never get out. I made the phone call and he came and rescued me. And the bond was so strong that it took years to break that. And the problem was, since I represented the individual and he wasn't impaired to the point where he couldn't make decisions, he was just vulnerable, I had to follow his wishes. And my husband and I both represented him, and we were angry with each other every time we had to deal with this case, because what we wanted to do was not what we were able to do. We could only do what our client allowed us to do. And we would constantly try to assure him that he could be taken care of. And when he finally allowed us to extricate him from the home and finally allowed us to make other arrangements, he was very happy. And he did, in fact, get a staff of caregivers who cared a lot about him and really tried to give him the quality of life that he wanted. But wow, it is hard to break that emotional bond.
Yeah. I think one of the other important points to make on this slide is around capacity. So I recently gave a training to El Paso, Colorado Springs Police Department on undue influence, and somebody from the DA's office was there. And one of the things I learned, we have more challenges, I think, cases getting cross the DA's desk in El Paso County, and rarely does it happen that it actually goes to trial. And one of the things I learned from that discussion was that they are looking for a capacity determination. When they have a person who lacks capacity, that's a win for them. That's a slam dunk, and so they're more likely to take those cases. But what we know is that these undue influence can happen regardless of, capacity. I mean, certainly capacity shapes that in a different way, but it happens in spite of or in light of having fully intact capacity as well. And especially in those cases where it's mild cognitive impairment, raises that risk. So I think capacity, again, is an important issue to consider. There's an association, certainly, between cognition and undue influence. We could talk all day about that, but some of the research has shown that cognitive impairment does increase a person's vulnerability. There's been some research looking at when a person has lower cognitive ability, the amount of pressure that's needed in coercion is less than if a person has higher levels of capacity. That makes sense probably to most of us.
And the way you think about it is there are situations where I've seen someone who, based on their education, based on their prior profession, they should have had a level of sophistication that would have caused them to discern that this individual was not the person they claimed to be, and that whatever they were claiming they could do for them was not something that they would have believed. They would not have been scammed like that. And so when you see someone who has lost some of that ability to discern whether or not this is an appropriate person, it's pretty evident that someone is impaired to the point where they've lost some of that judgment, some of that ability that they had before. Because you see people fall for things, and even the adult children will tell you, my mother never would have believed anything like that. She never would have let this person into her home.
Right, yeah. Other factors that impact one's mentation would be developmental disability or intellectual disabilities, mental illness, particularly in a state of mania where a person's judgment is very impaired and impulsive. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse can also impact a person's decision-making.
And are used by perpetrators all the time.
Yes.
Substance abuse in particular, that is a very handy tool to make sure that person has access to alcohol or drugs, if it's necessary in order to keep that person compliant, you will see that on a regular basis.
Absolutely. Or misuse of medication. So maybe it's not just substances, but withholding medications or over-medicating the individual. Personality disorders, this is kind of interesting research that's being done. Dependent personality disorder, where the person has kind of this needy personality characteristic that kind of sets up the perfect ripe condition for exploitation and for that relationship to be manipulated. And again, we could have a whole talk on dementia, but we know that dementia is a progressive disease. It's not a normal part of aging. It has broad cognitive impact depending on what type of dementia, and we think of dementia as an umbrella, and under dementia are certain types of dementia. Alzheimer's, vascular dementia due to medical illness such as a head injury or a brain tumor, substance-induced dementia, Korsakoff's dementia due to a thiamine B12 deficiency.
Hey, some interesting things about that. Two, first off, I always think of frontal temporal lobe dementia. Anybody had experience with individuals with frontal temporal lobe dementia?
Yeah.
That's crazy because it's you have a teenager in terms of the impulse control, only they've got credit cards. So just imagine what you can do with poor impulse control, reduced inhibition, and access to all kinds of things that can get you in trouble. Those are really difficult interventions because someone may appear to be competent to other individuals. I had a son who was chastised by a banker for having the audacity to take control of dad's accounts. Dad had given a very large engagement ring to someone he thought to be a 20-something woman, and it was a 30-something man who was a convicted felon. And Dad was very lonely and was looking for love. And didn't have the ability to understand or the impulse control, but was pretty sharp in a lot of aspects. And I think one of the things I discover with alcohol-induced dementia is when I'm trying to figure out what's going on, the family will deny this one. And so I'll look at someone who's physically too young to have the condition that's going on. And there's no specific diagnosis of any kind. It just appears to be some sort of cognitive impairment when we're trying to get a handle on it. When I ask about alcohol use, sometimes there'll be an outright denial or a diminishment of it. Then there's an evaluation, and it comes back, and sure enough. And there are a lot of people in skilled nursing due to alcohol-induced dementia.
Well, and I think, too, what's important about that is that both with alcohol-induced dementia, one of the key behaviors of that disorder is confabulation. So the person fills in the gaps in stories. And so perpetrators may capitalize on that. No, you don't remember. You don't remember, you're making it up. Same thing with Lewy body dementia. Lewy body dementia, one of the hallmark symptoms is hallucinations, visual hallucinations. And so they may say, you think you saw something, but you have hallucinations, you didn't see anything. So there are hallmarks of some of these dementing processes that can be used against the individual to discredit their report. Just some stats about dementia. I won't go into it for the sake of time. We know that there's an association between dementia and victimization. Higher prevalences of persons with dementia are victimized. There's been some research looking at caregivers who perpetrate on persons with dementia, and the reason that they give is that, you know, this person kind of pushed me to it. They become agitated, they become verbally abusive, and so therefore I act out, you know, either protecting myself or retaliating against them. And I think that this is really important to note that the prevailing myth about abuse occurring in late life is the caregiver burden theory. And that is that as one's needs increase and there's dependency increases, that may lead to abuse by the caregiver. But what we know now is that there are millions of caregivers who are caring for older adults who do not abuse them. And so the new theory that we've embraced as a field is that of power and control, that there is a power differential between those two individuals, and that is what leads to abuse. Again, these are looking at more in depth on the roles, on the factors, so roles and relationships, the manipulations, and I'm going to kind of breeze through these. I want you to have those. Also, I'm going to hold off on a case example because I suspect when we have some discussion, maybe some of those will come up that we can talk about. I've also included here some interview questions because I think it's important that not only do you take away the education from and some knowledge from this talk, but you need to have some real tools. How do I ask the question in assessing for undue influence, especially in cases of financial exploitation? So some of the questions that I ask in my interviews that I've included here is, how has your relationship with that family member or friend changed due to finances? How often has one person talked to you into a decision to spend or give money that you initially did not want to do? Have you had any conflicts or arguments with that individual or anybody about the way you spend your money or to whom you give your money? Has anyone asked you to ever change your will or power of attorney? Has anyone recently told you to stop getting financial advice from somebody in particular? Has anyone ever used or taken your money without permission? And if so, tell me what happened. And is there anyone now who wants to take or use your money without your permission? And what's the likelihood of that happening? Those are some questions that can start a conversation, that can open up for disclosure, and have been helpful. And these are not of my own. Actually, Peter Lichtenberg, a well-known psychologist who has really devoted his career to screening for financial exploitation and undue influence, has provided some of these questions in the literature, so please use them. I do want to say a word about prosecution and using expert testimony. So psychologists often do provide expert testimony in these cases. I'm one such psychologist that does that. We do this by two ways. One, of forensic evaluation. So we will go in and interview a victim. Psychologists can also provide a neuropsych evaluation, a capacity evaluation, and we may answer a case-specific question about that case and then provide that testimony in a trial. We can also do what we call social framework testimony, which is kind of what I've done here today around undue influence, about educating jurors. This is what undue influence is. These are the four components that happen, and then they apply it to the case, and it helps them make decisions around guilt and innocence.
The reason that's important, I had just was in my last year of law school and was interning with the district attorney's office. I never ended up being a prosecutor. I don't have the prosecutor's mentality, and I want to give everyone a second chance. So they kind of told me that. But one of the things they had just started to do, and El Paso County is a little slower than some of the other counties in Colorado, was to start prosecuting in domestic violence in cases where victims had recanted. And they were using expert testimony for jurors to understand. So they had some psychologists who would come in and talk about the relationship, the dependency relationship in domestic violence, and why a victim who might make an outcry at the time might later recant. So that when you had that initial outcry that was admissible in court, but the victim was now not willing to testify, they could still get convictions in some horrific cases where there had been the kind of injury where prosecution really needed to occur. So expert testimony in cases where you're in front of a jury or even a judge, because not all judges have the same level of sophistication in understanding the dynamics of the relationship, prosecutors can still get convictions if you can explain why it is the victim is unwilling to testify, why this would have occurred, and although it doesn't necessarily look like it wasn't of the individual's own volition, why it was.
Mm-hmm. So again, talking about that type of testimony, which we refer to as social framework testimony, can be very helpful. So, is there light at the end of the tunnel? So these next few minutes, I'm going to let Catherine really speak to, first of all, we all know about mandatory reporting. We know that, that's been new in our legislation. We were the last of 3 states remaining to pass legislation around mandatory reporting.
Yeah, and the thing about mandatory reporting is it's kind of had some mixed reviews. Now, one of the advantages is that there was a bit more budgeted for APS. Not enough, of course, because they never get all the funding they need, but there were, across the state, there were more APS workers hired so that when the police took a report and they wanted to send APS out, there were people to do it. The issues are, first, there are people who don't understand they're mandatory reporters. And again, sometimes people are quick to look at the situation and say, oh, well, this person has capacity. Therefore, whatever they're doing, they're doing of their own volition. Case closed, moving on.
Mm-hmm. So just to recap, I'm assuming most of us in here are mandatory reporters, but you have to make the report within 24 hours of just suspecting it. So you don't have to know that anything has happened. You are not tasked to be an investigator unless you are with law enforcement in this room. But for those of us who are practitioners or working in the helping professions, clergy, you don't have to know that anything has happened. You simply have to report it. And you can't be dinged or reprimanded in any way or have any consequences against you if you report something that wasn't substantiated, unless it's been found that you did that out of ill will, of course.
It's not just ill will. If you're the perpetrator and you report someone else, it's going to come back against you. That's an interesting fact that will happen. And you and I were actually involved in a case years ago where that ended up happening, that the person who reported, it's not uncommon for someone who's being exploited to be serially exploited, where a number of people realize that this person is vulnerable and everybody makes a grab for the cash. And one of the individuals did a report. I think it was the niece did the report. But the person she was fingering had, in fact, exploited the individual, but so had the niece. So, yes. The thing about criminal prosecution is it requires a lot of time poring over financial documents. And I work these cases all the time on the civil side. I've got one now that is going to involve a lot of spreadsheet work. Somebody has to sit down and look at money moving from one account to another and make spreadsheets that show, $60,000 came out of this account on this day, and here this other individual had an account and money went into that, or they purchased a house and they put coincidentally $60,000 down on the purchase of the house. Somebody has to comb through the financial records. And the district attorney's offices across the state will tell you that they don't have the resources to do that. Obviously, the armed robbery is pretty easy. You've got the camera, the surveillance camera, you've got a couple of witnesses, you find the guy with the gun and the money, and that's pretty easy to do. You can put that one together. But these Financial cases are very document intensive, very, very difficult. I've tried, one time I thought, well, the perpetrator wired the money to Florida, so that was wire fraud, and I should get the FBI involved. So I contact the FBI, and they come into my office and they look at my records, and then they laugh and leave because it was under $500,000 and that was chump change, and they don't get involved. So I had one case where I managed to get the district attorney to prosecute only because I was able to show them it was bank fraud. And the reason it was bank fraud is because the son had been basically looting mom's equity in the house through the reverse mortgage, which was a line of credit. And every year, you know, you get that little statement you have to sign saying you still live in the house. Well, for about 4 years, he'd been bringing it to the assisted living facility for mom to sign. But the last year, mom was too far gone to sign, so he signed his agent under power of attorney and signed the statement saying that she was continuing to reside in the house, which was clearly fraud. And at that point, I told the bank, you've been defrauded, and convinced the district attorney that, yes, in fact, this was bank fraud, got prosecution. Of course, we didn't get jail time or anything, but we did get a conviction.
Yeah.
So, but again, statutes of limitations are not long enough, and one of the problems you have is if the victim doesn't want to tell anyone what happened, by the time it's discovered, statute of limitation may have expired on the transaction. Okay. So prevention. You can appoint a representative payee to receive your Social Security, and that's not a bad idea if there's a trustworthy person that can receive the income and make sure that it's appropriately spent. If you're the out-of-state kid and you want to make sure that mom's money is being handled, it's not a bad idea to become the representative payee and to receive the income into an account and pay mom's bills for mom. When attorneys draft documents, they need to put standards in the documents regarding when gifting can occur, how gifting can occur. Can the agent make gifts to themselves? That's something that should be discussed when somebody's signing a power of attorney. You're giving your daughter control over your finances. Do you want her to be able to make gifts of your money? Well, what kind of gifts? $100 to each kid and grandkid on their birthday? Substantial gifts? Gifts to themselves? What do you want? Do you contemplate this? And that's an important thing to discuss. One of the things my firm's documents always call for both trusts and powers of attorney are accountings. We'll let the agent know in the document that they will be obligated to provide accountings. And we designate someone other than the senior to also review accountings. Because if the senior becomes incapacitated and is unable to review those critically, someone has to be able to keep track of the agent. The agent needs to know they're being monitored. So it's important. Now, under Colorado law, if I am a person interested in the person's welfare and I think the agent under power of attorney is not doing what they're supposed to do, I can file, first of all, I can send a letter to the agent saying, send me an accounting. And if the agent won't send me an accounting, then I can file an action in court asking that the court order this individual to produce an accounting. And you'd be interested to know that among the list of people who have the authority to do that is a governmental agency. And that language is intended to include APS, and includes public administrators, includes a lot of different people. So we have the right to go in if there is no one with a higher priority who's interested enough to do so, and ask the court to order this person to provide an accounting. So I think I wrote a law review article, power of attorney, dangerous document or convenient, I forget what it was, or document of convenience. And so it's kind of like two sides to the same coin. 99% of the attorneys out there who do estate planning say powers of attorney are wonderful, they assist my client, and then they don't need conservatorship, and it's a great tool. The 1% of us that see exploitation go, oh, powers of attorney, that's the perpetrator's favorite tool. Colorado does have standards now, but the absolute key is you've got to spend some time thinking about who you're putting in charge. Don't just choose your oldest kid. Certainly don't choose the kid with the gambling problem, please. But think critically about who is going to handle your finances the way you want your finances handled. Who do you trust who's really going to pay your bills and make sure your utilities get paid?
And I would just say to that, and you and I have talked about this before, that understanding family culture is really important, because there's a lot of maybe unspoken understandings within families about maybe it isn't the person who has the gambling problem, maybe that's not the person who should be doing it, but guess what? That's the oldest son, and in my family culture, or even in my ethnic culture, that's who gets that power. And so it's important for us to always think about how does the family culture operate, what is different about even the ethnicity of that family and of that individual, and how does that shape their decision making, because maybe, it shouldn't be that person, but because that is what our family has always done, or that's what we believe should happen, that's going to play an important role.
And I'm going to step out of prevention really quickly to talk about my pet peeve about people not taking the time to try to understand the family culture. We judge whoever this person was who was acting as the fiduciary by a set of legal standards that may shock them. They may not know exist. And it may be that within the family, what they were doing was completely ethical. Everyone understood this is the way they handled the prior generation's resources, and this was the expected method. And so when the legal system comes in and says, oh, well, you're a bad person and you stole your mom's money, there's a backlash from the family. How dare you do that? How dare you say that? My brother or my sister did nothing wrong here. And it's one of those things where everybody's right. They probably didn't do anything wrong, according to the family system. And they have a really hard time working with the legal system because the legal system has just told them that everything they believe is wrong. The legal system has to take a little bit of time to understand the family culture and work with the family. We are too quick to say, no one in this family is trustworthy, we're going to appoint a professional, they're going to be in charge of the money, and then there'll be a constant clash between the family's values and the professional's autocratic decisions. And so we have to try to work with the family. We have to try to understand. Obviously, those things that have to be remedied, particularly I'm always thinking Medicaid eligibility, some transactions cannot be permitted, have to be called back. But we need to try not to vilify people and not work with family just because they didn't know the rules. Mm-hmm. So one of the issues, getting back to prevention, daily money management. Has anybody here ever heard of daily money management? You can go online and look. Daily money managers. Now, they don't help people who have cognitive issues that don't allow them to handle their finances. These are people who just aren't good at it. Maybe this is the widow who's never done it before, and the kids are all out of state. She doesn't really want to give up control. You can use a daily money manager who will basically work with you and help you. So maybe this person will come to the home, or maybe they can meet with them at the senior center, and the senior brings their checkbook and their bills, and the daily money manager will work with them to understand the bill paying and help them make sure that the bills get paid. This may allow an individual to retain control of their finances a little bit longer because they've got some assistance, and the daily money management program would put someone in charge, or an assistant, not in charge, who is trustworthy, who's bonded, and who's been trained on how to do this and when they have to stop doing it and hand it off to someone who will make decisions. Again, attorneys bear a huge role in prevention. It is shocking how many times the perpetrator takes the senior to an attorney who is not critical enough about the relationship between the individuals, does not ask enough questions about the individual's cognition. I just did a deposition where it's a will contest, and the attorney had not been told the individual had macular degeneration, had not been told the individual had hearing loss, to the point where the medical record said often misunderstands what's said, and had been diagnosed with dementia some 7 years before the will was done. That completely changed the senior's estate plan. And I never met the individual, but I have a hard time believing that that would not have been apparent had the attorney done some due diligence in terms of discerning whether or not this was appropriate. Another red flag was the fact that the attorney corresponded via email with the individual who brought the senior to them, never with the senior, and sent drafts to that individual. Oh, because the senior doesn't do email. Okay. And this one comes back to bite me sometimes. I'm constantly railing on courts in Colorado and actually across the country when I speak, require fiduciaries to bond. And the reason to require fiduciaries to bond, bonding basically is an insurance in case the fiduciary steals. So if the fiduciary steals, the bonding company will make the individual whole, and then they'll sue the fiduciary. For that reason, the fiduciary has to qualify. So they have to produce their financial information to a bonding company, and then there's a fee that the senior will have to pay. It's well worth it, because when the money's all gone, to be able to get it back from the bonding company as opposed to having nothing left is worth it. The other thing is, if you can't bond, there's a reason. This person might not be trustworthy to handle finances. So think about that. One of the things you can do if you don't want to pay the cost of a bond is you can restrict some accounts. And restriction under Colorado law means the bank will sign a document that says, we took this account under restriction, and the money doesn't come out without a prior court order. So I might take a person, I've got an estate now with $2 million, and we're going to bond for, I think, about half of it, and we're going to restrict about half of it. So bonding so that we can put it in some investments and move things around and not have to get court orders all the time. And then about $1 million of it will be under restriction. And any time money needs to come out, then the fiduciary is going to have to ask the court via a motion for some money, and the court will sign an order allowing a certain amount out. And the financial institution is not supposed to let the money out without the court order. Every now and then they do, and then I sue the bank. And I get the money back from the bank. So another important thing is that when the court appoints guardians and conservators, they should put restrictions on their letters of office that say what their authority is, say what they are and aren't allowed to do. And those letters need to get recorded in the property records. People think that appointing a guardian and conservator is the panacea and is going to solve the problem. I am an attorney who makes her living in guardianship, and I'll tell you, that is not the end of the abuse and exploitation. The guardianship system has some serious flaws, and we need to always be concerned about whether or not the guardian or conservator is doing their job. They need to be monitored all the time. Financial institutions notice all kinds of things. They notice changes in banking behavior. I've gotten a lot of reports. I do some investigation that's referred to me by APS when there's no physical abuse suspected and just financial abuse. And one of the things that bank tellers will see is they'll see somebody who routinely goes to the bank every Friday and withdraws $200 cash, and they've done that for years and they're friendly with the tellers, all of a sudden start using ATMs in the lobby instead, and someone else is assisting them in using the ATM. Well, that's kind of a red flag. Here's somebody who just never knew how to work one, never did use one before. Now all of a sudden their withdrawal pattern is different, and they're not socializing with the bank tellers anymore. One of my pet peeves are gifts and loans to professionals who provide services to the seniors. And I had an example that could have happened in my own home when my mother was dying of lung cancer and was on hospice and living at home. My stepfather wanted to give the caregiver her car. And I said, you can't do that. I said, her agency won't allow her to receive gifts. Her car is on its last legs and she doesn't make a lot of money. She's gonna want that car in it. You cannot dangle that in front of her. It's too much of a temptation and she's not allowed to keep it. So he said, well, I'll sell it to her for $100. I said, same thing, you can't do it. So I'm really sorry, but you're just gonna get her in trouble. Now that's because it was a legitimate agency and they had employees who were bonded, employees who were not permitted to take gifts. But many people hire caregivers in an informal process, and then they want to gift the caregivers. I've had situations where attorneys, who should know better, are receiving gifts in their clients' wills. That's a pretty clear no-no. Had a case where the financial advisor had a 529 plan set up for their kids, funded by his client, the senior. And we don't have legislation that makes that clearly prohibited. California does and would be a great model for us to follow. But we should have some clear rules that if you are paid to perform services for the individual, you can't have gifts. I think in California, you have to see, the individual has to see an attorney and discuss it in order for it to be valid. But bright line rule is there shouldn't be gifting.
So we just want to conclude, and I know we've gone over, but again, just thinking about elder financial abuse, some of the common themes that we've discussed here today is that certainly isolated older adults make better targets. People who have been recently widowed or people who have moved into newer living situations, sometimes the exploitation is not discovered until after the money is gone. And sometimes these cases don't go to court until after the victim has been deceased even. And even when confronted with a promissory note, an exploiter may deny that the debt exists or will claim that it was paid or forgiven. So, do you want to?
I think we already talked about this.
We kind of talked about some of this. And
so I think one of the things I think that we've really talked about is it's not bright line. These issues are complex. And remember that mom loves the exploiter. If the exploiter is her ne'er-do-well son, you don't serve her by removing the exploiter. You can protect her finances and find a way to allow her to continue to have the relationship if she's not being physically or emotionally harmed by that relationship. And I think that's really important when we consider interventions. Consider family systems, consider relationships, respect autonomy as much as you can, and try to make your intervention benefit the senior.
okay, we've got some questions now.
I appreciate your presentation very much, especially the psychological and the legal together, which really is very helpful. That's the one thing that I've been exploited as a senior, and I'm over 70, I'm elderly. But, and I think it should be brought to the attention because it's the one on construction, because elderly people hire people to do work. And these people are some of the best exploiters, and you see them on television. And I would like to see some information on that, not, you have the 5%. I know you didn't do the study, but that was very interesting. But these exploiters are these, roofers and the contractors, and they're getting harder and harder to get a hold of these people because right now, people are finding it very hard to find these people, and they hire these people, and they're very, very good at it.
One of the, and like I said earlier, we focused on that relationship, which those crimes don't, I mean, the person comes to the door and it is a convenience. But one of the resources that I will direct you to is AARP has Elder Watch.
Yep.
And Elder Watch through AARP, and they have an office here in Denver, actually.
Really?
And you can go either online, or they have an 800 number, and you can call them to report a certain business, but then also they will send you notifications of recent scams so that people are aware, look out for this kind of scam or these individuals. So they're a wonderful resource to...
And they are something that you can help your community by receiving that information and passing it on.
They have flyers that you
This
can...
happened in Grand County, where we are
yeah.
trying to, that community is getting very much elderly.
Yeah.
We don't appreciate some of they don't take seriously. I'm not an elderly person that's been abused because I'm able to communicate.
Right.
Yeah.
And, the psychological aspects were not. And we can't self-report or have another person report, unfortunately, out in Grand County.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a lot of problems, and I think this one needs to be brought out so that people are aware these construction people are really sometimes very
Thank you
abusive.
for bringing, for at least telling us where you're from, because one of our missions here is to expand some of these trainings to more rural Colorado. So thank you. Appreciate that.
Was it Grand County?
Grand County.
Grand
yeah.
County.
I think I'm scheduled to go out there in September. Yeah.
Good.
I think it was the county executive has asked me to come out.
Lee Staub?
Yes, Lee Staub.
I sent him your name and
Yeah, okay. And I think I'm bringing someone from Jeffco's Sheriff's Department with me.
Terrific. Wow, great connections.
Charles?
No, Charles is from El Paso, and his budget, they don't allow him to go that far. It's too far beyond. But I think Jeffco is going to allow someone to come. So.
I was wondering if you could talk about, in the Colorado law, what it is that makes a person who's living in someone's property, in other words, a renter, different when they're considering him as an abuser or her as an abuser, and why that a problem that the renter would create would automatically make it, in Colorado, a civil case, even if they did things like not pay their rent for 7 months, or stole the furniture and gave it, sold it to somebody.
That's really fact-specific, and maybe when we're done, we'll talk to you about that. But it's really fact-specific, and so I'm looking right now to see whether there are any more general questions, and then we can talk to you at 11, but we have to give the room back, so.
Hi there. I don't know if this is too specific or not, but we have a case. I'm from DHS, and my colleague here is from a skilled nursing facility. We have a client in the facility who is being exploited sexually and financially. We suspect lack of capacity for him and his spouse, who's also in the room. The perpetrator is aware now that she's being investigated. She's trying to move him out of the facility to another facility.
Okay, so there's an intervention, and the abuser thinks that by moving the individual, they can escape the intervention. I've got a couple of different things there. One is that's a good time to talk to the ombudsman, and it's important to find out who is a decision maker for that individual. And if they're not a decision maker, then maybe this is a case where if there's not someone who's a medical power of attorney, there needs to be a guardian appointed who can override a placement decision that's being influenced by somebody else.
And actually, just FYI, it's the one I called your office about yesterday, about transferring a trust to possibly you.
Ah, okay.
Oh,
So I'm going to get the case anyway. Okay.
Yeah, it's a fun one. It's a fun one.
There you are.
Law enforcement is involved. I've now got the bank involved because this person also took
Okay.
a credit card. So
Okay, yeah. So you and I will talk about that. Yay, more work. So any other questions?
So,
I'm an advocate for Dove, and you were mentioning, oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot I needed the microphone. Sorry, guys. Should I sign that all again? Just to make sure. So sorry, guys. Okay, so I'm an advocate, I work for Dove, and you had talked about mandatory reporting, and it had to happen within 24 hours of your suspicion. Do you have is there a number for APS, or is there a hotline number that you can share with us?
Good question. You're supposed to call law enforcement and not APS. Law enforcement is the screener for the call.
And they're the required party to do the 24-hour.
Gotcha, law enforcement.
So you would want to call your local dispatcher number for your county or your city.
Gotcha, the dispatcher.
And then
and I
once
do have a
you-
second question.
Well, okay.
So can I follow up after I've made that report?
The problem,
Or is it, do I report and then it's over?
part of the situation is
that
that you
appropriate?
make a report, and they may follow back up with you if they want more information, but you may not be someone entitled to information if they decide to move forward.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So how do we use an ombudsman like you? Can you help screen situations or
Wait.
discuss them?
Actually, Catherine, we have the ombudsman here.
Right.
Hi, I'm
That's
Leah
perfect.
McMahon. I am the state PACE ombudsman. We have jurisdiction in assisted living homes, nursing homes, and now the program of all-inclusive care for the elderly. Each assisted living home and nursing home has a poster hanging up with the ombudsman information, as well as the program of all-inclusive care for the elderly day centers have the contact information on posters. You can look up your area agency on aging in your region or your county and find the ombudsman phone number there as well.
And the ombudsman is an individual that, first off, they're trained, and they've got resources to back them up, which is always good. And their job is to advocate for the interests of the resident. And so sometimes the issue will be between the facility and the resident. Sometimes it will be between the resident and people who are coming into the facility to visit the resident. The ombudsman is not always the silver bullet, but it's a good place to start because in addition to their training, they have resources.
Does that include residents that are getting in-home care? Do you deal with those?
Only in PACE, I think.
Only in the program of all-inclusive care for the elderly
Yeah.
at this point in time.
So then can we also contact you at Disability Law Colorado for help in understanding what to do?
The problem that you have is it's a question of what kind of an intervention is needed. If the individual needs to have legal assistance in order to make certain that their wishes are what are carried out and they're capable of sustaining an attorney-client relationship, then a referral to counsel who is trained and can work with an individual who is either elderly or disabled, can work through whatever's going on and help the individual through whatever legal resources are needed to make certain that their wishes are respected, that's great. But it's not always a situation that calls for legal assistance. It's not always a situation that calls for law enforcement assistance. Sometimes this is a case where the family needs a mediator to sit down because mom's getting whipsawed by different family members. So in terms of what the intervention should be, there is no one easy answer. Have to know more about exactly what's going on to give somebody an idea.
We've got maybe another few minutes if we have one more question we could take.
I think you didn't answer this question about, can you just call the center and get some answers?
Yeah, can the center give you answers?
Yes. Yes, he can call, and we provide, ombudsmen provide consultation, information, guidance, and can, if it's not in the purview of the ombudsman program, then we can refer you to the appropriate people.
And don't forget your local AAAs. We always forget that the local area agency on aging may have resources that other people don't have. They're federally funded. They have referrals, and they have a variety of resources. I used to say it was like a Rolodex, but my younger clients don't know what that is.
Well, we thank you all for coming and sharing the morning with us. My email information is on the first slide, but you can reach us through CRAP, and the slides will be uploaded typically within 2 weeks, so you'll be able to get this presentation and the slides. And also, Ms. Seal has been gracious enough to forward to us some of the articles that she's written. So those are also will be uploaded for your resource. So thank you again for being with us, and have a great day.
Thank you, Dr. Gibson and Ms. Seal. Please return your survey as you are leaving, and you will receive your certificate of continued education.